Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
On this week's episode, Katie and I venture back into the Premise Dome to settle a decades-old debate. What's the best werewolf movie of 1981? Is it John Landis's An American Werewolf in London or Joe Dante's The Howling? Stick around as we bare our teeth and pick a dog in this fight.
Welcome to Film Club.
All right, Katie, so it's Halloween week. In fact, as folks are listening to this, it's Devil's Night, in fact, the day before Halloween. Do you have any fun Halloween plans this year, in so much as you can have plans during what's going on right now?
Well, it's also a full moon on Halloween this year, and so the vibe is going to be extra witchy. So I have a little Zoom party planned. I'll read some tarot cards over Zoom, light some candles, maybe watch a witchy movie, just, kind of feel the vibe.
That's fun.
Yeah, go buy a pumpkin pie at the store.
Okay, that's fun. Yeah, I'm watching horror movies probably.
Oh, cool, man.
Yeah.
I feel like I've watched so many horror movies this month already. It's not really a complaint. Like, what's left for you to watch? The entirety of horror cinema, I guess.
I kind of do a little mini marathon every year. A mini horror marathon every year around Halloween. Obviously, I can't really do that in the way that I normally do this year because of the pandemic. Can't have people over and such.
You usually go out then and watch horror movies.
Well, no, I usually just have people over. But
yeah. That's why we're reading tarot cards over Zoom.
Yeah, exactly. But gonna watch some movies. Have a lineup of films that we're watching. Gonna do Pulse, which we talked about recently on what films really scare you. I feel like I haven't seen that since 2005 or something, so I'm excited to watch that again. We're going to watch the underrated Strangers sequel. So
yes, Pray at Night.
Pray at Night, yeah, which has one great sequence in it. If you have not seen that film, I know what you're thinking. A sequel to a sequel to The Strangers. Did we really need this? Maybe not. But there are some great stylish moments in that film, including this wonderful moment by a swimming pool that is sort of imprinted on my brain. Just a great piece of stylish filmmaking. So it is Halloween week, but we have been celebrating Halloween all month here on Film Club. We've been talking about horror movies all month. If you're interested in hearing us gab about that, there are 4 other episodes. We did 5 this month, all devoted to the genre. So this is kind of our grand conclusion to that. And for it, we are returning to the Premise Dome. Now, the Premise Dome is a concept that Sean O'Neill, former AV Club editor and writer Sean O'Neill, came up with years ago, that we finally launched as part of the Film Club podcast back in the spring, really towards the beginning of quarantine, towards the beginning of the lockdown. And we talked about White House Down and Olympus Has Fallen, the 2 Presidents Under Siege movies that came out the same year, in fact. And the Premise Dome in general is our way of basically pitting 2 films, twin films is the phenomenon. It's where 2 movies that have very similar premises come out around the same time. And here on the Premise Dome, what we do is we take those 2 films and we each take a side in that debate. And we talk about them. You may eventually see a print version of this or something. We really just sort of decided it was time to dust off this old AV Club idea and give it a shot. But we're doing it again today.
I've always liked this idea.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I don't know why it took us so long to get it off the ground. I know that it was Sean's baby for many years. He really wanted to do it, but we finally got to it. So we are doing a Halloween edition of that this year, today, in fact. And we are talking about 2 movies that came out in 1981. About 6 months or so between them. The kind of 2 big werewolf movies of 1981, and that is John Landis's An American Werewolf in London and Joe Dante's The Howling. Now, I should say, for starters, that there actually were 3 major Hollywood wolf films that came out in 1981. The third film is Wolfen, and I know that film has its fans, and it also has, it's been years since I've watched that movie. I do remember there being an incredible decapitation in that. We rewatched The Omen recently. That is a great decapitation. I would like to one day make a super cut of the best decapitations in movies, but Wolfen has a good one.
I think Zach Carlson at the Alamo Drafthouse already did that, actually.
Oh, he beat me to the punch? Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, that's like his specialty. That's one of the things he does is he does this thing called 100 Best Kills where he sort of makes supercuts of different types of things. And I'm pretty sure they did one called Decapitack. That was all decapitation.
Got it. It's not like I have the skill to put something like that together anyway. That's actually more your wheelhouse than mine, to be honest. But
they're very time-consuming supercuts. That's the thing.
I would bet. Anyway, so Wolfen came out the same year as well. It actually came out, I believe, between the two films, between American Werewolf in London and The Howling. Mm-hmm. And but we're not considering it today, both because I don't think either of us would consider this better than either of the two films we're discussing, but also because, spoiler alert, in Wolfen, they're not actually werewolves.
Right.
So they're like a species of highly intelligent, a secret species of highly intelligent canines, basically. So yeah. So we're gonna stick to the werewolf movies, both of which came out in 1981. I don't know what was in the air that year that people were just ready for werewolves again.
What's interesting about that is that, this whole thing is predicated on twin films, but I don't really think of these as twin films in the same sense as I think of White House Down and Olympus Has Fallen, because like the idea of the twin film is two films that are conceived and produced in competition with one another. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's just perception, but I don't think of these two films that way. I think like this is just more of a coincidence. Like you said, something was in the water that people were ready for werewolves again.
Yeah, I'm a little bit curious if the prospective companies who put out these films were aware that that they were working on them at the same time, right. Essentially,
Right.
Universal released An American Werewolf in London, and The Howling was from Embassy Pictures. But they were both Hollywood films, and they were both actually pretty big hits. It's my understanding. They both did pretty well at the theater, in theaters. They have some similarities beyond just being about werewolves. Both films inspired sequels, although The Howling got a whole franchise worth, I believe, like something like 7 or 8 films or something.
Pretty dismal franchise, to be honest. One of the worst ones.
It's really not good. I feel like it's like down there with Jaws in terms of like the discrepancy between the original
and drop off.
Yeah. Although I remember kind of enjoying even in their, because I watched all the Howling sequels. Growing up, I like rented them all after seeing the first one, and
sure.
I remember at least all of them having some element in their premise that was fun. I think the 6th one is it brings a vampire into the equation, so it's like a werewolf versus a vampire, and but pretty bad in general. As was, I will add, American Werewolf in Paris, which came out in 1997. That was the very belated sequel to An American Werewolf in London.
Yeah, very belated.
Yes, and that film is sort of I haven't seen that film since I saw it in 1997, and I remember at the time thinking this is a case study for why CGI is not as cool as practical effects. I can't even imagine how bad those werewolves must look today.
Well, like going up against the legendary Oscar-winning special effects at American Werewolf in London,
Yep. That's interesting. So both films also have incredible transformation scenes and great special effects. So yeah, obviously American Werewolf in London has its famous transformation scene that won Rick Baker an Oscar for the very first Best Makeup Oscar. But The Howling has its own special effects maestro, Rob Bottin, who came in to do the effects on it, and obviously he's another master of practical effects. So they both have that going for it. They both have these elaborate transformation scenes. We'll talk about those, and they both have elements of comedy. Obviously Landis was coming from. Landis was straight off of Animal House and the Blues Brothers. He had done those two back to back. This was kind of his first foray into horror, but there's a lot of comedy in it. And Joe Dante was early in his career as well. He had made Piranha, which Steven Spielberg once called his favorite Jaws ripoff. And Dante's films have usually had an element of comedy. He would later, most famously probably, he would later do Gremlins, which The Howling helped him get that gig, actually. And there's some comedy in The Howling as well, although it's not as pronounced as the comedy in American Werewolf in London.
Oh, really? Because I would argue the opposite. I would argue that the tone of The Howling is more overtly comedic, while American Werewolf in London is more realistic. Yeah. No,
really?
Yeah.
I do not agree. I mean, well, I do think that we're going to get into this. Obviously,
Okay.
we're going to get into this. I think they both have aspects of comedy in them. I think that the Howling plays a little more straight. I think there are long stretches of the Howling that are just meant to be suspenseful or scary, whereas I think American Werewolf in London is kind of always dual operating. I mean, think about the big transformation scene in American Werewolf in London. Most famous scene in the movie when our main character finally turns into a werewolf about midway through the film. And even during that scene, that famously like scary and impressive scene, he makes a joke about calling his friend who has become this undead, played by Griffin Dunn, has become this undead specter, sort of urging him to kill himself. He makes a joke about calling him Meatloaf in that moment. So I mean, I just feel like American Werewolf in London, there's always a joke lurking within a few scenes.
I think that there are more. I think that American Werewolf in London is more of a darker, edgier film, perhaps in terms of its comedy. Like some of the comedy is very British, and it's very comedy of manners, which is very dry. Mm-hmm. And some of the humor is very black. And there's some there's some dark themes in American Werewolf in London. Like you were mentioning, his friend Jack, who gets killed by a werewolf at the beginning of the movie. He keeps coming up and saying, "You need to kill yourself. You need to kill yourself." And that's pretty dark stuff, you know?
Oh, for sure. But I mean, the Howling opens with our main character, played by Dee Wallace. She is she's a news anchor who has been getting threatening phone calls from someone who the police basically believe responsible for a series of brutal murders.
Yeah, it's a Richard Ramirez type of thing. What it reminds me of. Yeah.
Yeah. But that opening stretch is not funny. I mean, it's actually very. It's very, very unnerving, and in some ways, like kind of a little unsavory. In fact, I mean, she basically, at that point, he is not playing the comedy at all. And I would say Dante has, again, as on a whole, has always kind of mixed comedy and horror throughout a lot of his career. I mean, a lot of his films sort of walk that line. I think that it's a little bit more, it's a little bit less pronounced in The Howling.
Well, yeah, I consider that kind of blend of comedy and horror, that's Dante's signature in my mind. And it comes out to different, extents in different parts of in his different films. And actually, if there was one thing I could excise from The Howling, I would take out the undercurrent of sexual violence.
Yeah.
Because I feel like next to the sort of comic booky, pulpy tone of the film and the way that it looks is very bright and colorful and comic booky. Next to that, I think it sits very uncomfortably and and it's kind of borderline misogynist. And if I could take one thing out of The Howling, that's what I would take out.
Yeah, I agree that it's a little uncomfortable. I do think that it ties into what that movie is trying to be about to some extent.
Sure.
Somebody says late in the film, somebody says you can't tame what's meant to be wild. And I think the film is at least partially about the idea of people in modern society sort of reaching for enlightenment, and there being a backlash against that in some parts of modern American society, circa the early 80s at this point, obviously, of people saying, no, we are wild animals. We should be wild animals, and so we should believe in our animal impulses. There's this whole through line about the main character's husband, who is this. Very early in the film, he obviously feels a bit emasculated by the fact that his wife is this famous news anchor, and everyone's constantly saying how brave she is, and he's a vegetarian. So there's this whole thing about him getting back in touch with his manly side. I don't know how well developed that really is in the film, to be honest, but it's there.
Yeah, that the theme of going back to the wild side and tying that to this persistent imagery of S&M porn and the Eddie the serial killer has he wants to sexually assault Dee Wallace's character, and that being equated with the wildness inside of man is, I think, the part of The Howling that I don't particularly care for, even though I am defending this film. In terms of comedy, though, I honestly disagree that The Howling plays it straight for most of its running time. I think it's a very colorful, there's a scene where a barn is on fire and there's someone trapped inside, and and they punch out boards and then orange light comes shooting out. And to me, that is the same sort of visual style that you saw in Creepshow a little bit later. And I think there is like a fair amount of like 50s horror comics in the Howling, and that sort of thing is kind of, to me, inherently playful.
Yeah.
Whereas American Werewolf in London is drier and a little bit more real, I guess, in terms of the violence of it.
Well, then I guess maybe what we're really talking about is more about a sense of style and how they approach this stylistically.
Mm-hmm.
I agree that Dante's film is more heightened in some respects than American Werewolf in London, which I think is maybe a little bit more straightforward. Although I do think that part of its comedy is built on that too. This idea that we're seeing these fantastical events, but Landis presents them in a way that's almost a little straightforward at times. It is not a. You know what I'm gonna do now actually is I'm gonna say we should announce our positions on this. Maybe the listeners have gotten a sense of it. That's what the Premise Dome is all about. Is we are defending one is better than the other. I will say up front that I like both of these movies a lot, but my heart belongs to An American Werewolf in London.
Yeah, I like both of these movies as well, and I acknowledge that American Werewolf in London is a good film, but like, there's something about it that has always been a little bit off-putting to me. And I think it's just sort of that, like, there's something about it that is very baby boomer and very baby boomer male. And like, the only woman in the movie is the love interest, and she just completely falls in love with this guy who's ranting about how he's a werewolf, but she's just there to have sex with him and go, I love you at the end. And I always found that a little bit off-putting, honestly.
I mean, she's definitely a fantasy. There's no question. The whole film in some respects is a fantasy. Again, Landis had done Animal House 2 films back, and in some respects, the character who our main character, played by David Naughton, his name is David Kessler in the film. David is, in some respects, could be seen as sort of a refugee from that movie. It wouldn't be impossible to see him as a member of the good fraternity in Animal House. The heroic fraternity. So the movie sort of it sort of operates on this premise of like, what if we took this kind of immature, sex-starved college kid and threw him into a classic werewolf story,
it's just so I guess solipsistic is the word for it, that it just doesn't really resonate with me. And I like The Howling is hardly, there's a lot of male gaze in that film too, but at least it has more than one woman who has a conversation with one another. Like, that film passes the Bechdel test technically.
Yes, it does. So yeah, I mean, I've been a fan of this film of American Werewolf in London for I would say most of my life. I've talked before on the podcast about how it's basically the first horror movie I ever saw, which rewatching it last night sort of reinforces how inappropriate it was that I saw this when I was like 4 or 5 years old or something. But so I can't be entirely objective about it, but I do think that I can make the case for it. I hear what you're saying about it being kind of a male fantasy. I think it is. I think also I don't think there's not as much going on subtextually in this one as there is in The Howling. Although I'd argue that The Howling is maybe a little muddled in what it's trying to say about the animal within us or about society. I don't think American Werewolf in London, you could say that a werewolf is always a metaphor for something else.
All monsters, right?
For sure, yeah. And I'm not sure in American Werewolf in London if there is a particularly satisfying. If it's a metaphor, I'm not sure exactly what it's supposed to be a metaphor for. I mean, the fact that he's a horny college kid and it represents that or something, because I mean, he definitely comes across. I mean, they establish very early on. So his character is sort of on a backpacking trip through Europe with his buddy Jack, played by Griffin Dunne, and they're starting their trip in Europe in Yorkshire. and they're sort of doing some backpacking through there. During a very chilly time of the year, and when we first meet them, they're just sort of talking like, you know, young, immature, horny dudes. And David comes across as the sort of the marginally more enlightened of the two, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, at a certain point, it basically turns into like he's in the hospital after the attack. His friend has been killed, and if you took out the werewolf stuff, it basically does turn into the story of a college kid who has a fling with a sexy nurse from the hospital. You know, which is I hear your point that she's not much of a character. She is just kind of this supportive figure. She's like this dream
like
girl. You know,
she's like a sex mom, which is kind of, I mean. Whatever, guys. Like, I know that some guys like that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, you know, in terms of themes in American Werewolf in London, I mentioned this being a very baby boomer movie, and I think of that because I do think there is an element of that sort of 60s hangover in terms of the generation gap in this movie, whereas all the older British characters are shown to be just very, like, they're, like, them and David are operating on two, like, they might as well come from two different planets, you know?
Yeah.
And so I sort of see there being a bit of a 60s hangover there. And I think that in that sense that this movie is a little bit about, you know, maybe like an identity crisis, you know?
Yeah, I can see that. I think it's maybe more though just about a culture clash. I mean, I think the comedy in the film, a lot of it stems from, I mean, essentially the film is a fish out of water comedy with a werewolf element thrown on top. I mean, he's an American student who's sort of constantly being pitted against, you know, British decorum in some respects.
Right.
The early scene, I mean, once he gets to London, it's a lot of stiff upper lip, but the early scenes in Yorkshire, there's a very famous scene where they walk into this pub called the Slaughtered Lamb, and they stick out like a sore thumb there. They're these American kids who are sort of. I will say this: it's fun to think of the film a little bit as like it's a film a little bit about a dumb American sort of blundering his way through another culture. You know, I mean, the movie doesn't put too fine of a point on that. It's not like he's constantly like denigrating the culture or anything. But I mean, they do sort of blunder their way into this saloon. They ignore the warnings given to them, and then it's sort of about his. I think there's a part of you that can look at this film as being about the stereotype of a dumb American, even if I think that Kessler is not, his character is not as boorish as maybe he could have been, one might say.
Right. Yeah, no, I will give him that. Like, as a character, he's not, he seems to be a relatively enlightened male for his times, I guess, the way you put it. Or he's just like, you know, a regular, decent person, you know? He's not a cartoonish character.
He's not. And I actually think it's a really good performance, to be honest. I think he's I don't think this movie gives anybody a lot of nuance to play necessarily. You know? Like, I don't think there's nobody in this movie that is a really richly developed character. A lot of them are kind of archetypes in a way. But I think that he brings a kind of nice grounded comic energy. He's never overplaying the comedy of it. I also really like Griffin Dunne in the role as his friend. He keeps coming back in these. He's killed by the wolf in the beginning, and he keeps coming back to visit David and tell him, no, listen, you're a werewolf. You need to kill yourself. But he's constantly kind of teetering between these very, very serious warnings and his kind of old personality. You know?
Well, it's funny you mention his character coming back. Like, you keep describing the film as like a fish out of water comedy, but I honestly don't find American Werewolf in London very funny.
Really?
Like, I don't find it all that funny. None of the jokes really make me laugh. And I find the stuff with his friend coming back more just like disturbing than anything.
Well, I think that Landis is towing the line. I mean, I will say that I find it, I guess comedy like horror is very subjective. I find a lot of American Werewolf in London to be very funny, and but I think that a lot of its comic strategy is this teetering, and I think it does something that it walks that line in a way that not enough horror comedies do, where I think it is explicitly funny in spots, but it never uses that comedy to undermine the horror. Because I mean, if you want to talk about the scenes where his buddy comes back, I mean, so the comedy didn't work in those scenes, but what was still coming through for you was the horror of them, and
yeah,
one might say the graveness of the situation, no pun intended. That was coming through for you still, because I don't think the film's comedy, even in those moments, was stepping on the horror. I mean, I get frustrated sometimes with horror comedies. There's one that I really, a recent one that I guess actually most people would not classify as a horror comedy, but that would be David Gordon Green's Halloween reboot, that has moments of comedy in it that to me felt like they were constantly undermining the horror. Like it was constantly stepping on its best scares with dumb jokes. And in this one, I think...
You know what other movie did that?
What?
Was It Chapter 2.
Yes, that's a great example,
It Chapter 2 definitely steps on its own toes that way.
Yep. So it's a hard line to walk. I mean, I think there are plenty of horror comedies out there. I don't think a lot of them actually get that blend really well. I think what works about American Werewolf in London, and I think there's a reason that Landis, despite mainly working in comedy, has come to have this reputation as like a master of horror or whatever. I think it works because he plays a lot of the horror pretty straight, you know?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if John Landis' sense of humor in general is for me.
Yeah.
Like, even in a movie like The Blues Brothers or Animal House, there are jokes in there where I'm just like, that's just not funny. Like, that's just mean. I find that there's a bit of a cruelty in John Landis' sense of humor that I don't really appreciate.
It's a little lowbrow for my taste a lot of the time. Although, again, I do think it works like gangbusters in this film, to be honest. I actually find this movie funnier than something like Animal House, which I know has this reputation.
That's wild to me because it is not funny to me at all.
Okay.
Like Jack coming back, his friend, like if anything, I'm sitting there being like, yes, the 70s, Vietnam, a bunch of young boys lost their best friends, you know, like,
yeah.
Like I don't find it humorous. Like I think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is funnier than American Werewolf in London. It just
you don't like the
doesn't work
banter
for me.
between them?
Not really, no, because they're talking about how some girl is dumb, but she's got a good body.
Yeah.
So, like, that doesn't work for me.
I mean, they do immediately get attacked by a werewolf shortly thereafter. So, you know, they get what's coming to them, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, but, like, I don't know. I just find the whole Enterprise very solipsistic and navel-gazy, and it's just like, oh, I get it, you're a baby boomer. Jesus fucking Christ. But the effects are very good.
Oh, the effects are terrific. I mean, the famous sequence where he transforms, you know, I mean, that took a very long time to film and it's very elaborate. I think it still works really, really well. I think part of why it works so well is that it's like Landis figured out exactly the right combination of shots to use. He knew where, you know, I mean, as with any werewolf sequence, you're faking somebody going through a transformation, so you have to sort of sell the audience on that happening. And I feel like the way he constructs the scene is that we're seeing these little details of him changing, and we're seeing a number of basically a number of steps between man and wolf. So every shot is progressing us a little bit closer to him being this full werewolf. Also, I think the werewolf effects itself are pretty cool too. I mean, just when he's in his full form.
Yeah, the werewolf effects are pretty cool. And when this movie is being a horror movie, I like it better. I just, like I said, like there's just something about John Landis's comedy that's never really done it for me. I find it a little bit mean-spirited.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. You would say that you do think that the scare scenes, for example, work.
Yes, and I actually, it's funny, you know, like we interpret these things so differently. Like there's a scene in the middle of the film where David has a nightmare that these Nazi werewolves come to his house and kill his whole family, and it's very subtle, but you see like a menorah in the background, and I find that to be very like symbolically resonant and like sort of this like echo of like the trauma of the Holocaust carrying through the generations, which isn't funny to me. I don't know. Like,
no, it's not. I mean, they mention early in the film in the form of a joke, like one of the nurses looks at his penis when he's in the hospital, which again is like, well, that's kind of a violation. But yeah, I mean, I think his identity as a Jewish American is something that's there in the film. I don't know what the movie does with it, really. But I agree that dream within a dream sequence I've always found really, really frightening. Again, partially that might be because of how long. I mean, I saw this as a kid, and it's sort of stuck in my brain ever since. But the whole idea of a nightmare within a nightmare is a really Have you ever had one of those? They're very scary. You like think you're
A
awake.
Nightmare Within It? No, I have never done the double wake up, which you see in movies a lot.
You
I
do.
have never done that.
I've had one before, and it's very. You're like, okay, I'm awake now. Wait a minute.
Oh man, that is scary.
Yeah.
I've seen a triple wake up in a horror movie before, which is just a cheap trick.
Take it a little far. I think by the
Yeah.
third time, I'd be like, okay, I'm definitely still dreaming. Nice try.
Yeah, definitely
Nice
asleep,
try,
yeah.
brain. Okay, so you prefer The Howling to American Werewolf in London. It's The Howling is obviously directed by Joe Dante. He's working from a screenplay by John Sayles, who obviously would go on to have his own career as a very successful writer-director.
Yeah, but they both came from the Roger Corman factory, and Sayles wrote Alligator, which I don't think was a Corman production, but he was involved with, B movies, and I believe he also wrote Piranha.
Yeah. Yep. And in this, he's adapting a novel by Gary Brandner. I mean, there is. So you think this movie is funnier than American Werewolf in London?
Yes, I think this movie is funnier than American Werewolf in London. I think it is perhaps a less personal film and a more satirical film. I think this film is it's painted with broader strokes. It's more pulpy. I compared it to a 50s horror comic up top, and I stand by that, particularly in the sort of bright and colorful aspect. I think this movie is more fun to look at than American Werewolf in London, and I think it's more of its time and place. It's Los Angeles in the early 80s, and so you get some media satire in there, particularly in the ending of this movie, which I really like. I think the ending of this movie is hilarious. And I also it's also kind of satirizing like California woo hippy dippy new age culture, which is always ripe for parody in my opinion. And also just on a personal level, the Northern California looks like a much more pleasant place to hang out than the moors of England, even when it's raining.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely this movie has more of a the setting in general. I mean, because a lot of American Werewolf in London takes place in London, as the title says. So after that opening passage, we're sort of in a one could say a slightly more unconventional setting for a horror movie. Whereas I think a lot of the Howling takes place in this kind of this foggy woods basically in California. Yes. So it's a very it's foreboding kind of fairy tale setting in some respects. But I have to say that I think that while it's sort of a fun idea, this commune of hippie werewolves, I can't really quite track what this film is trying to say about the counterculture. It's interesting that you brought up that you feel like American Werewolf in London is like a 60s hangover film. But this film is, in some respects, very explicitly about like about a hippie commune. After the 1960s. Right. I mean, it's set in contemporary, obviously, in the early 80s, and I just can't quite parse exactly what it's trying to say about that, if anything. I mean, there is this idea running through it of I mentioned this earlier that her husband is sort of getting back in touch with his masculinity or something. But how exactly does that track with the notion of like the sort of free spiritedness of like a hippie commune? I don't know.
I think he's just kind of taking the piss out of the whole thing. This movie is also you are right that there is a bit of post 60s hangover in this film too. Like, for example, at one point, great character actor Dick Miller appears as an occult bookstore owner, which is one of the reasons I love this movie. I just love the idea. I want to go to an occult bookstore owned by Dick Miller, talking in his Dick Miller voice, being like, "Oh yeah, we got that movie about devil worship you want." Like, that is extremely charming to me. And there is one point where they go into the occult bookstore to do research on werewolves, which is another trope that I always love in horror movies, which is when they're doing research on the monster that's stalking them, or their friends in this case. And Dick Miller says, yeah, those Manson kids used to come in here and shoplift. So there is a bit of a 60s hangover in this one. But I think that Well, actually, I think The Howling is a movie that is absolutely ripe for a remake because it is dated in some ways. I was talking about the themes up top. I think a more contemporary movie might be able to handle the sort of trauma aspect of the whole narrative perhaps a little more sensitively.
Yeah.
But like the new agey stuff is a constant in California. That's just part of the landscape of California. Yeah. And, if you did remake this movie, you would still have plenty to work with in that aspect. So I would say that the new agey stuff isn't necessarily specifically 60s.
Yeah, but it's interesting that you brought up that line about the Manson family because looked at one way. I'm kind of spitballing here, honestly, because I don't think that the film has a necessarily completely coherent thematic idea necessarily. I think you're probably right that it's more just sort of taking the piss out of this particular scene. But, I
don't know if Dante's movies, like, I think they're just supposed to be kind of pulpy fun and poking fun. I wouldn't, I like Joe Dante's movies a lot and I like his style, but I wouldn't call it especially deep.
No,
honestly.
Although it's interesting that I talked about this recently on the podcast as well. And this week, if you're interested, this week on the AV Club, we ran a ranking of the Masters of Horror episodes. That's Showtime series that they from like the mid 2000s, where they sort of Mick Garris assembled all these famous horror directors, and they each got to direct an hour-long episode for TV without content restrictions. And Joe Dante does 2 of those episodes, and they're both actually there's a very pronounced political dimension to both of them. One of them, I would say, almost to a fault, to be honest. But traditionally, I would not think of him as somebody who a filmmaker who is particularly interested in finding the socio-political angle to the horror. I don't really think that's his sensibility overall.
Yeah.
That stuff is kind of here under the surface a little bit.
A little bit, but I don't think that it's the priority. I think that the priority is just making a fun werewolf movie. Yeah. Actually, one interesting common theme that I've noticed in both of these films, which is very of these filmmakers' generation, because they both come from that 70s film school generation, which is the generation of Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, whose careers are kind of built on pastiche of the stuff they love. In a lot of ways, Joe Dante's career is built on that as well. And for example, in American Werewolf in London, they make reference to the movie The Wolfman, and that's kind of how he understands his plight. But I think The Howling does it more explicitly and perhaps more successfully, kind of like in the background of it, you see the pop culture that is informing this story, this sort of wink and a nod to like, yes, you all know what's going to happen because you've seen The Wolfman, you've watched Looney Tunes cartoons, you know what happens when someone turns into a wolf. And I think that it's got this kind of knowing quality to where it is consciously playing on 50s monster movies that's very winking and fun.
Yeah, I think they're both very self-aware about their place in a lineage of horror, and that these are both films that do very explicitly nod to the history of these kind of movies. One thing I actually really like about them is that they do adhere to certain conventions, even as they obviously put a then more modern spin on them. They both have characters that are investigating. In The Howling, it's these two investigative reporters who are looking into the background behind this killer who they think has been killed in the beginning of the film, and they're sort of diving into his world and his obsession with werewolves. In American Werewolf in London, it's this stiff upper lip doctor who goes out to Yorkshire to investigate what really happened on the moors the night that David was bitten and his friend was killed. So they both kind of take that essential element of werewolf movies and work them in, even as they're doing their own thing.
Yeah, and The Howling does it, like I said before, with sort of a pulpier comic book tone, which to me is more entertaining.
Okay. Yeah, it's definitely. I think it's a more heightened film in a lot of ways.
Yes, aesthetically, it's very heightened. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Dante is on a whole is a much better director than Landis is. I do think that Landis's particular approach to American Werewolf in London, again, I think part of its appeal and part of its comedy is built on that it's not is that it plays all of this very matter-of-factly in some respects.
Right.
Whereas Dante is sort of relishing the otherworldly stuff. He's relishing the pulpier aspects of it. The werewolves in The Howling look great too, I'll say.
Yeah, they both I like the werewolf design in both of them, and later on in The Howling there is a transformation scene that is it's a little bit goopier. They put a little bit of Vaseline on the werewolf transformation in The Howling, which is a good time.
Yeah, it's long. I mean, it's directed differently too. I mean, again, I think that in London, the Landis sort of takes the strategy of, I'm going to give you a series of shots that show him at different points in this progression. We get a shot of his hand extending, we get a shot of his back, and it's sort of a lot of the work is being done by the particular shot selection and the editing. I feel like what Dante does is he really puts his trust into Rob Bottin and into his effects work, and we get these prolonged shots. It's almost this bubbling effect that they're doing.
Yes.
Where the flesh is like the flesh is like bubbling as he changes. I think it's a phenomenal effects scene in The Howling too. I really like the effects in that film too. And Bottin would go on to do the effects for what I think might be the great special effects movie of all time, actually, which is John Carpenter's The Thing.
Right, which is also, perhaps that's just Bottin's style, that sort of stickiness, because The Thing is also very sticky effects in that film as well.
Totally.
Yeah, I really like Bottin's style, and you're right that Dante does let the camera linger on it longer. Like, for example, like you said in American Werewolf, they cut to different parts of the transformation, but you watch the nose turn into a snout in The Howling, which is a cool shot.
Yeah. And there's something in London. It's almost more. It's almost like we're seeing the bones. Like I feel like the big distinction between them might be that in American Werewolf in London, it's a fundamentally a structural bone change, whereas in The Howling, it's like the flesh itself is mute. I mean, maybe I'm drawing a distinction that's unnecessary here, but I do feel like that The Howling is fleshier in a way in the transformation.
Yeah. Oh, totally. It is fleshier. And, and like we were saying, that might come down to the individual style of these two effects artists.
Yeah.
In terms of the final design, I find the werewolf in The Howling to be a little bit more fantastical, where it has that like kind of pointed head with the long pointed ears. Yeah. And I find that to be, again, a little more fun.
Yeah, I think it's cooler. Ultimately, the final werewolf. I mean, I think they both look great. In London, I think he's kind of, he becomes this sort of oversized wolf. He sort of looks almost like a bear in the way that it moves,
Yep.
Where, I mean, and also he basically moves on four legs in American Werewolf in London, and they're almost these slightly more humanoid creatures in The Howling, and these really tall, imposing creatures that walk on two legs. And I mean, I'll give you that. I think the final werewolf design in The Howling is cooler.
Yeah, and well, we talked about Wolfen and how they're actually a race of wolves. In The Howling, they have a little bit. They go into the werewolf mythology a little more deeply in The Howling, largely through Dick Miller and his occult bookstore, which is just, like I said, a place I want to hang out at. And, and they get a little bit deeper into the mythology, and they actually deviate a bit from, standard werewolf traditional mythology in The Howling by saying that they don't have to change on the full moon. They can change whenever they like.
Right.
And so that's a little different. There are some traditional elements. You can only kill them with silver bullets or fire, but they explicitly kind of posit them as shapeshifters who like to change into wolves, as opposed to being sort of bound by the full moon, as in American Werewolf in London.
For sure. Although, I mean, American Werewolf in London tweaks it a little bit too. I mean, there's a moment when he's like, when him and the fellow corpses, you really didn't find the scene where he's talking to all of them in the theater to be kind of funny? I mean, he's like talking to all of his victims basically, and they're sort of like one of them just feels super impositioned by it, and the two of them are a little almost still cheerful even after death.
I don't know. I just see Vietnam in that scene.
Yeah. In that scene, even they basically say, well, you could shoot yourself. They're like giving him various ways he could kill himself, and he says, well, I mean, doesn't it have to be a silver bullet? And Jack says, just be serious here, So I mean, even in American Werewolf in London, it, like, sort of throws out the whole silver bullet thing as well. So it's not It's not sticking strictly to the standard mythology of werewolves either.
Yeah, and I will say, in American Werewolves in London's favor, even if the humor doesn't really resonate for me, I do find that, like I said, the Nazi werewolf sequence, and that sequence in the theater, I do think is very effective. It just doesn't make me laugh.
Got it. Well, again, I'm not sure that scene is supposed to make you laugh. Again, I think that movie is walking a line where it's sometimes you're supposed to find it funny and sometimes you're supposed to be scared by it. I mean, I love the big attack sequences in American Werewolf in London. I think they're really effective, and I think that Landis kind of mixes a couple different approaches. He'll often, a lot of them use this kind of these sort of shot cuts where the werewolf suddenly appears and then we cut immediately away and we just see the aftermath. And it sort of keeps the wolf. We're not getting, until the end, we don't get these prolonged look at the wolf. He just kind of appears in frame as this horrible thing, and then we cut away. But then there's also that long sequence in the subway where he's stalking that guy that I think is really, that is very suspenseful.
The subway scene is very suspenseful. It's actually scary. I will say that The Howling isn't very scary. American Werewolf's definitely a scarier movie.
Interesting, because I actually, it's so interesting that the different sides of this were on, because I think that The Howling works more as traditional horror than American Werewolf in London does a lot of the time.
Oh, wow. I think it's just so like tongue in cheek and silly, and knowing that like it's not really horrific. It's just fun. It's just fun with makeup and the full moon and misty woods and stuff like that.
Sure. Okay. Another thing they do have in common is they both have these great early 80s downbeat Hollywood endings.
But I find the ending of The Howling hilarious. I think it's so funny.
It is. Well, part of that is the makeup. I actually, or the special effects. I think that she does look a little silly, I think, in those final moments.
Well, she also looks more like the original Wolfman.
Yeah, she does. That's true.
Yeah,
that's true. But I mean, it's nonetheless, it's a downbeat ending. I mean,
oh, sure. Yeah.
Standard spoiler warning, I should say. Listeners.
Standard spoiler warning. But I think it's really funny, the idea that you could turn into a werewolf on live TV and everyone will go, that's not real. That's fake. Like, I think that that's really hilarious. And I think that there's like, the tongue in cheek knowing bit, Dante really hammers it home at the very end of the film, where Dee Wallace's character, to prove that werewolves are real, turns into a werewolf on live TV. Yeah. And then her colleague shoots her, to kill her on live TV. And they cut to all these different people that are watching it on TV. And there's two little kids watching it going, Mom, the news lady turned into a werewolf. And Mom's like, that's nice. And then, and then there's a guy watching it on TV talking to himself in Spanish, like, come over here, look at this. Oh, brother. And then they cut to a bar full of drunks. And one of the drunks is like, hey, that lady killed herself on TV. And they're like, no, she didn't. That's not real. That's like in a movie. And there's this really winking acknowledgement that we're watching a movie. And by having that shot, it's almost like those drunks are commenting on the entire 90 minutes we just watched, which I think is just very, it's a one last little nudge on the way out the door, which I think is really fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might actually be the most overtly comic sequence in the whole film, at least the reactions you're talking about. Whereas I think American Werewolf in London is keeping a comic tone through a lot of it. Although I think it's interesting, the ending, I think, is one place where the jokes kind of completely cease. I think that another
very
element
downbeat ending,
very much so, and I think a lot of a big element of a lot of werewolf cinema is the element of tragedy, in the notion that again, in The Howling, they're sort of they turn into werewolves by choice. In American Werewolf in London, he can't control this, so he becomes this tragic figure in the end. And I think that the final scene with him, when he's been cornered in the alley, is I find genuinely a little affecting. And I love how abrupt it is at the end. We just see his body on the ground, his human body, cut to credits. you know?
Well, that's interesting because I feel like the ending is like he didn't know how to end the movie, and so he's like, I guess we'll kill him. And then that was the end. Like, I think it's abrupt in a bad way.
No way.
Yeah, no, I feel like he didn't know how to end the movie.
No, it is a deliberately abrupt, tragic ending. It's just like, here we are, like we don't need anything afterwards. It's just, he's dead on the ground, end of movie. You know,
we can argue the deliberate part.
I want to see more of that, honestly. I would like more movie. I don't need a denouement where she's like visiting his grave or something, or we're seeing like a tease for a sequel or something. Just fucking end it. He's dead. He's on the ground, dead. End of movie. Also, it's a great comic cut into the song at the end credits, I'll say too. But
the song they already played up top.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think the doo-wop in in American Werewolf in London really just completely underlines the baby boomer of it all.
It's definitely a boomer soundtrack.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I gotta disagree. Like, to me, The Howling feels like a full story that wraps up, and like it wraps up its different storylines, where American Werewolf in London is just like, he gets turned into a wolf, he kills some people, he meets his, like, if he had committed suicide, I think that would have been a more fitting wrap up to the story, because than him just leaving the theater and all of a sudden, boom, he's dead. I think that it is just, the narrative just runs into a brick wall, and I don't find it very satisfying.
Okay, well, I disagree, obviously, but I like the fatalism of the ending. I sort of feel like in some respects this is the only way it can really end. I think it would actually be rather anticlimactic if he just kills himself at the end. That to me would be more abrupt than this final showdown with the police, basically.
Which hasn't really been an element in the movie up to that point. I don't know. It's just, it really felt like they didn't know what else to do, and so they just stopped it.
I'm not with you on this one.
Well, that's the point of the premise, Dome, my friend.
Indeed. I will mention that we ran a poll, actually, the night before we're running this... before we recorded, rather, sorry, and sort of asked readers to weigh in. And currently, I mean, it actually has, as of recording this, it has 2 more days, so this could change radically by the time that people are actually listening to this. But currently, American Werewolf in London has a very solid lead on The Howling. It's currently 82% to 17%.
Oh, wow. That's a bloodbath. Wow.
It is. Which even as somebody who shares the belief that American Werewolf in London is the superior film, I do think that these should be closer, because I actually do think they're both pretty strong films, and they both do some really fun and interesting things with the werewolf mythos.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It was fun to do a double feature with them, you know?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, like it's they have so much in common, but like they're so they take similar subject matter and play it really differently, which makes them a really fascinating double feature. And even with, my personal, my problems with American Werewolf in London are fully just personal opinion stuff. I think in terms of filmmaking and what it's doing, it is a very good film.
Yeah. I think you might really be onto something, though, about this. I've been thinking about it more and more as we're talking about this this idea that they're both post-60s films. And they maybe just, I mean, so you mentioned early on, you mentioned that line about the Manson family that Dick Miller says in the bookstore. I mean, it's possible to look at The Howling as a film like the 60s countercultural movement. There were wolves within that movement.
Oh, yeah, totally. Well, and the 60s counterculture movement, you talked about that theme of the natural man or whatever. They were all about that. They were all about running around naked in the woods.
Yep. But ultimately, I mean, again, I'm kind of spitballing here because I'm not sure that The Howling totally finds what it's trying to say about that, if it is indeed trying to say anything coherent about it. But I mean, you could say that even though they come across as it's this new age thing where they're very enlightened, ultimately there's something something literally regressive about it. They're literally regressing back to early man, so and also, I mean, the idea that the husband becomes he's this vegetarian who becomes a hunter, and the sexual politics in these films is very interesting, because I do think that London,
very interesting.
I do think An American Werewolf in London is partially like, can we keep the party of the 60s going? You know, he's like this.
Oh, interesting.
This kid who wants to go and have like a fling and be sexually liberated with this woman in the UK. It kind of gets his fantasy, honestly.
But he can't though. Like he can't because of because of the violence that follows him, and that's why I say that I think that I see some like echoes of the sort of trauma of Vietnam in that movie.
Very interesting. Yeah, I'd never thought about it that way. But yeah, I think they actually are both post-60s films in a lot of ways. They're literally post-60s films, but I think they're both about, maybe both about the end of the 60s and about the end of the sexual revolution.
Yeah, totally. And that's interesting what you're saying about The Howling, too, because like there is, a lot of modern day horror movies deal with characters' trauma. And it's interesting that The Howling, I don't think that it's really being especially thoughtful about it. I will say that. But it is kind of a predecessor to these early films because you have this character who she goes through Dee Wallace's character has this traumatic experience at the beginning of the film, and she has flashbacks to it, and she has nightmares, and she goes to this retreat and has therapy to try to work through it and all this stuff. And I think that is a little ahead of its time.
Yeah, I think so. I was rewatching the film last night. I was definitely struck by it. Again, I'm not sure how successful it is, but I do think that it is interested in her post-traumatic stress. I think also the movement from the city to the country is interesting. She's going from this supposedly dangerous big city into the country, and then finding that has followed her, basically.
Yeah. That's a whole there's a lot of tension between but the dangerous city and the dangerous country. That pendulum kind of swings back and forth like throughout the decades in horror films in general, I think.
Yep.
But yeah, that whole commune element you're talking about, there were some wolves in sheep's clothing in the 60s movement. All right, everybody, that's all we've got for you this week. Both The Howling and American Werewolf in London are available as digital rentals. The Howling is only available on Amazon Prime as a rental, not on iTunes. So if you're looking for that, fire up Amazon. And in the meantime, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Reif. It was produced and edited by Carl Blumberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Seth Hafer, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. We're off next week, but we'll be back with a brand new episode in November. Thanks.
Bye. Happy Halloween.